I wonder if it really would be that hard to just give you like an action bar with the borrowed power. I mean, would that really be that difficult to code? Because the code was already there once. I mean, I guess the problem is that not only did you have borrowed power, but they always rework so much stuff as well. I wonder why they always do that. That is like one of those questions that I never really understand. Like, why do they always rework classes so much? Because like look at Moonkin. If you look at the past couple of expansions, Moonkin changed so much all the time. And I really don't understand why. Why does it always have to change so much? To keep the game fresh, I assume. But do people want that? Like, is that actually something people... Because we already get so much stuff because of borrowed power, right? Like, the way I see it is that you play a spec, and each expansion has so much borrowed power that the spec automatically changes a lot in itself, just through borrowed power, right? Why does the base of the class also need to change that much? Like, I personally wouldn't mind if Moonkin just stays the way it is, and then the borrowed power changes. Because then you automatically change the way you play, or why not just give us new talents every time or something? Like, they can just give us a couple of new abilities. That's how Final Fantasy does it, right? In Final Fantasy, each expansion gives you like new abilities, like 1 or 2 new abilities or something, that changes your rotation a bit, and that's it. And in WoW, you could do the same, where you just add a few new abilities and borrowed power, right? So you lose your old borrowed power, you get some new base abilities, and then you get new borrowed power. That's gonna change the spec already by quite a lot. So I don't understand why you always have to like remake the complete like talent tree or something. Final Fantasy also removes abilities a lot and reworks classes all the time. Yes, but not to the same extent as it happens in WoW. It's not as completely... Like, if I think about Moonkin, if I compare Moonkin to like MOP, for example, it's so different. It's like, it's not even the same spec anymore. In MOP, Moonkin was so different, you could call it a different spec even. It was inherently different. Everything about it was different. So it's not just like a few changes here and there. It's like they're just reworking everything. It's so weird. BFA felt like Legion Part 2 because they didn't change anything. Wait, what? They changed so much in BFA though. I really liked the way Moonkin worked in Legion. And then in BFA I hated it. The biggest reason I think why a lot of people like Legion Moonkin so much was because the astral power generation was really high. And it scaled really well. And then they nerfed it in BFA. So, and they kept it this way. In BFA and in Shadowlands, we barely generate any astral power. And it's just such... I just don't like it. Like, it's such... It just feels so much boring. So much more boring if you generate very little astral power, because then you're just sitting here spamming like fillers. You know, you're just like rough, or like starfire, you know, because you literally don't have enough astral power to use it on spenders. And then on top of that, starfall cannot be stacked. So if you're in an AoE situation and you already have starfall up, then you're not even using astral power. Like, then it's not even worth it. Then you're just sitting there overcapping your astral power. It's like, okay, great. Like, it just feels bad. If you're not a fan of the base version of Moonkin now, wouldn't you then be for changing the base class in the next expansion? Which goes against what you said a few minutes ago about not changing base classes. Yeah, so when I say that they shouldn't change the base class, then I'm saying they should stick to a version that people liked. Of course, if there's a version of a spec that no one likes and people don't like it, then yeah, I agree that it should be changed. But a lot of the time, they can change it in a way without completely reworking it. Like, for example, the way Moonkin is now, in my opinion, it could be changed in a way that is not completely reworking it, but it's gonna be improving fun a lot. Like, for example, Starfall right now is like this huge radius around us. And I think, I mean, that's cool. People like that. The problem is that Starfall cannot be stacked. And that's a problem. So if you make Starfall stackable, then that would be a change that is not super invasive, in my opinion. Like, it's not going to completely rework the class. You just make Starfall stack, like, so you can have multiple Starfalls up at the same time. And then you increase the Astral Power generation somehow. They could just do that by buffing Shooting Stars, which is a passive, right? In my opinion, they can change Moonkin in a way that is not like a complete rework. Just change the existing spells in a way that it's more enjoyable to play. The reason why I don't like current Moonkin is not because I completely dislike everything about it. I just dislike some parts of it because of like the way its tuning works. So for example, if Starfall would be stackable, if we would have more Astral Power generation, if our dots would be more meaningful, if our Star Search wouldn't buff our Eclipse. You know, so, like some of these changes would make it more enjoyable to me, and it wouldn't like completely change the way the class works. The big issue is that what people say they like the best is usually the big dam, which is why when Max did the survey, everyone just picked when their class was OP. I mean, maybe that is true for most people, but I think I personally can look at it pretty objectively. No copium. I'm pretty sure that when I think about Moonkin, I can think about it in an objective way without being blinded by the damage. I think I can say that. Because, I mean, at the moment, Moonkin is really good, right? But I still don't like the way Moonkin plays. Right? And I think a lot of people maybe agree with this statement even. Like, a lot of Moonkin players maybe agree that Moonkin is not so fun right now, even though it does big damage. Right? Delete Eclipse again. Yeah. Eclipse is definitely, like, I don't necessarily dislike Eclipse as a whole. I don't think it's that bad. The problem is the way Star Search interacts with it is bad, in my opinion. Like, I think Star Search should not be buffing our Eclipse. Because that's just weird. That creates a really weird gameplay, in my opinion. For example, the Moonkin Theorycrafters, they're really, like, good. Probably one of the best Theorycrafters of any spec in the game. And they actually always provide really, like, constructive feedback posts during beta about the actual issues that they think the spec has. You know? Like, about actual, not about, like, tuning issues. They don't say, oh, this doesn't enough damage or this doesn't enough damage, but they're actually like giving feedback on what feels bad. For example, they gave feedback about Starfall not stacking being bad. Like they already wrote that in a like a letter to Blizzard before Shadowlands even came out. Like before Shadowlands came out, they wrote this letter and they're like, not stackable Starfall, bad. Bad Astral Power generation, bad. You know, like they wrote all of this down in like a really big, constructive letter with like graphs and everything. Like it was really well done, but then, you know, nothing came of it. So in my opinion, it's like maybe they should be listening to those people. You know, because I understand that they're not listening to the whole community as a whole, because as you said, a lot of people's opinions is tainted by damage. So sometimes people are just like, oh, this class does a lot of damage, so it's the best at the moment, right? But the Theorycrafters that really logically and constructively think about their spec and give like huge feedback posts, maybe those are the people that they should be listening to, right? Like if a dev walks up to one of the Moonkin Theorycrafters and says, hey, could you give me some feedback about Moonkin? Then they will be so happy to provide, like, literally, like, pages and pages of feedback. Like, they would do that for free, without anything. And then if the devs are using that or not, I mean, that's up to them, obviously, right? But just looking at it and thinking about the feedback might just, like that would be enough in my opinion. But then you run into the issue that the class is only going into the direction the Theorycrafters would want. Then it's better to ask no one in the community than to ask some. I mean, no, I disagree. Because I think when it comes to gameplay, there's a collective understanding between enjoyment of something. I'm explaining this weird. But if a class feels smooth, that's the word people always say. Either something feels clunky or something feels smooth, right? And this smoothness is something that is like, it's not like a subjective thing. It's almost like objectively correct among like the whole player base or the majority of the player base, right? For example, something like Demon Hunter. Demon Hunter feels smooth, right? And a lot of people agree. It's like, oh, Demon Hunter, that feels so smooth, like blah, 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 right? And there's a reason behind that. And it's literally just something that can be, that one person can figure out that is a theory crafter that knows a lot about the class. Right? Going back to Moonkin, for example. I said earlier that it feels bad that we don't generate a lot of astral power. Because what happens if we don't generate a lot of astral power is we have to spam a lot of our fillers, which is Wrath and Starfire. And I think everyone collectively agrees that standing still and spamming a filler is bad gameplay. Like, that's just not fun to anyone, right? Or to very few people. Like, if you have to stand still and you just like Wrath, like that just feels bad. And I think that is like a collective, like I think people agree on this, right? Most people. So at that point, you could say that if the astral power generation increases, like the passive astral power generation, then that would solve that issue that you have to stand still and cast a lot of fillers. And you're replacing some of those fillers with spenders. Like, it's a lot more fun to cast Star Surge than it is to cast Wrath. And I think that's like a, I think everyone agrees with this opinion. It's a lot more fun to spam Starfall than it is to spam Starfire, right? And that's just a thing, right? And I'm pretty sure that the theory crafters are the best at identifying the issue, because a lot of the player base sometimes doesn't understand necessarily why the class doesn't feel fun. Because they're not so knowledgeable about how everything interacts with each other, right? Like a player that is on the more casual side maybe starts playing a spec, and then they're like, I don't really like this spec. But if you ask them exactly why, then they maybe cannot pinpoint it. They maybe they're like, I don't really know, like it just doesn't feel good, They maybe don't necessarily understand all the like connections between the abilities and how the class works, and therefore they don't necessarily understand why exactly they don't like playing it. But a theory crafter, they will know everything about the class and how everything like interacts with each other, and then they will understand why something doesn't feel as fun or as smooth, right? In my opinion. For example, the Shadow community is rather split for having the old Void form and current Void form. The theory crafters prefer the old Void form, but the player base likes the new Void form due to it being... You're misunderstanding me, because you're talking about personal preference, about a working system. Like, clearly Void form in its current form is not inherently bad, right? Like, it's not clunky. And just because someone prefers the old version doesn't mean, like, that's just a personal preference thing that the dev is gonna decide. The feedback of the theory crafter is not gonna help. Like, when I say that the theory crafter should give feedback, then it shouldn't be a personal preference feedback, but rather a function of the class feedback. For example, the thing with Moonkin, generating more astral power and casting more spenders, that's not a personal preference thing. That is literally a functionality of the class thing, right? The class feels bad because you're spamming too many fillers, right? It's not that people literally like spamming fillers. It's not a personal preference question. It's literally just literally everyone hates this question. Make it different. You know what I mean? It's not a red or blue color kind of choice that it's like a 50-50 split in preference. It's literally just like, this feels horrible, this feels good, right? And in the end, it's always gonna be the devs that decide anyway. I am not saying that a dev should listen to a theory crafter and then do exactly what they say. That's obviously not gonna happen. All I'm asking is that they listen to what the theory crafters say and then maybe, you know, do some of the stuff that they think makes sense. Because if a theory crafter gives feedback about a spec, then they will give proper feedback that will literally be like listed and explained exactly so the dev understands what they mean. If a random person of the community gives feedback, they're gonna be like, this sucks. And the dev is gonna be like, oh, well, okay. But if a theory crafter gives feedback that is exactly explained and detailed, then maybe the dev thinks about it in a different way all of a sudden and be like, oh, wait, you are right, this does make sense, you know? And then if the dev decides to change it or to take the feedback into account or not, that is a different kind of story. That's up to the dev to decide, right? Like the developer is not gonna take the feedback of a theory crafter and apply exactly that to the class. But maybe they take some stuff and some they don't take, and whatever. They obviously have their own idea on how the spec should work. But getting really good feedback sometimes I just feel like that the developers don't actually, like, they don't have, obviously they're not gonna have like bad intent. Like a developer is not gonna sit here and be like, I want this class to feel bad. Right? Like, they don't have bad intent. They want the class to feel good. They don't intentionally make something bad. But maybe sometimes they just don't think of something. Or they don't think of a solution to the problem. Because that's just, that's normal, right? Maybe there's a solution to the problem or the cause of the problem that they don't really identify, but the theory crafters do. Like, what if the theory crafters identify, you know what? If we could change this to interact this way instead of this way, then maybe it would feel better. And maybe the developer didn't actually think about that. Maybe they didn't have that idea. And then when they read the feedback, they're like, oh, wait, that is an interesting idea. You know, like, that's what I mean. Like, they should just be, like, getting ideas from the theory crafters. Because clearly the theory crafters have so much knowledge and so much, like, detailed opinions about a spec that it can only be helpful. Like, it cannot be bad, right? It can only help. And if they don't take any feedback, well, then they don't. They don't have to. In this case, isn't the preference actually less powerful spenders that we spend more often versus more powerful spenders that we spend less often as an example? Yes. Yes. I want my spenders to be less powerful, but I cast them more often, yes. That is what I want to do. I mean, you could argue that that is a personal preference thing, right? You could argue that some people maybe like using spenders less often, but for them to do more damage, right? I mean, I see that being an opinion. I totally see people saying that. But then your fillers would have to be more interesting. You cannot have boring fillers and spenders that you barely ever use. Like that's where the disconnect is, right? If you play a class that has like really big, powerful spenders that are not casted really often, then your fillers need to be interesting, right? If you cast spenders more often and they're less powerful, then it's okay if your fillers are more boring, right? Like if your fillers are boring, then in return, your spenders need to be casted more often. But you cannot have boring fillers and at the same time you have spenders that are barely casted. Like that's like that's the worst combination of both. It needs to be one or the other, right? Fillers are supposed to be boring, hence the name filler. No, fillers don't have to be boring. That's a big misconception. Fillers don't have to be boring. They can have an interesting way of how they work. A boring filler is spamming the same button over and over and over and over and over. That's boring, right? An interesting filler could be if there's like some sort of rotation with your filler spells. Let's say you have like 3 or 4 filler spells and you have to decide on what you cast depending on your resource, right? Or maybe there's procs. Like maybe one filler procs another filler, and then I don't know. Like there has to be some sort of interaction between the fillers that make it more interesting and not just mindlessly press one button. I mean, Moonkin had interesting fillers in the past. Or maybe, I mean, not super... Yeah, we did. I mean, Moonkin had decently interesting fillers in the past. It was never, like, super intricate. But it was more interesting than it is nowadays, right? Like Final Fantasy Red Mage rotation. Yes. Yes. Final Fantasy Red Mage kind of has... Yeah, I guess it's a good example. Like, their filler abilities are not so boring that they would be mindless. Like, it's basically your base rotation. Like, your base rotation as a Red Mage in Final Fantasy, you can compare it to Moonkin. Imagine Moonkin would have lunar astral power and solar astral power. Okay? And imagine my solar wrath would give me solar astral power, and my lunar strike would give me lunar astral power. And the way Red Mage works in Final Fantasy is that you want to keep your astral power or your mana at like somewhat balanced level. That's the way that job works. And that would make it somewhat interesting, right? Because then you have your lunar astral power and you have your solar astral power, and you need to look at both. And you have to like figure out which filler that you should be casting to make sure that it stays balanced, and so on, right? Like, it's just an example, right? I mean, for example, the old Affliction Warlock as well. I thought that was pretty interesting. It wasn't like super difficult. If you think about Affliction Warlock before 9.1, I thought that was kind of cool. Like, you had... Your filler spells was just like a huge amount of dots, which is not like super interesting, but at least it's like something that you have to pay attention to, right? It has to be like not so mindless. The way Affliction Warlock worked in before 9.1 was you just had like a huge dot line and you had to keep up your dots. That's it. Like, it wasn't incredibly complicated. But it made you at least think about it a bit more. Like, you had to pay attention to your dots and when they're gonna run out, right? And you had to keep a look at your like shard generation. If the filler becomes so boring that you never even have to pay attention to it or like just glance at it and you're done, then that's when it becomes boring, right? Unfortunately, making something interesting usually translates to make it powerful. I disagree. If your fillers are too powerful, no. It doesn't have to be powerful, just interesting. I don't think that's the same. I don't think interesting needs to be powerful. I completely disagree with you. Fillers being interesting doesn't need to mean that they do a lot of damage. Like, for example, when I talked about Affliction Warlock just now, right? before 9.1, I thought Affliction Warlock has like a decent filler rotation. And by filler rotation, I just basically meant keeping up all of your dots. That's the filler rotation, right? And I thought that was decently interesting because you had to keep track of a bunch of different timers. So you had to look at this dot's timer and this timer and this timer and this timer. So there's like a bunch of different things you had to pay attention to. And then you refreshed it. It wasn't like incredibly complicated, which it shouldn't be. Your filler rotation shouldn't be like super complicated. But it should be so complicated that you at least have to pay a little bit attention to it. That is what I mean. It doesn't have to be doing a lot of damage at all. Fillers that are boring or things that you mindlessly press without really looking at it. For example, the way the Moonkin fillers work right now. Moonkin is so incredibly boring filler-wise. It's not even funny. Like, it's actually so boring. Like, what do you do as a Moonkin? What is your filler rotation? If you're in Lunar Eclipse, you press Starfire. If you're in Solar Eclipse, you press Solar Wrath. That's it. That's your filler rotation. Like, that is so boring. You know what I mean? Like, you don't have to pay attention to anything. The only thing you have to pay attention to is which eclipse you're in. Which, I mean, like, that's not a difficult thing. That's literally just like, oh, I'm looking at my bar. It is blue, I'm casting blue spell. It's yellow, I cast yellow spell. Like, it doesn't have any intricacies that makes you pay attention to it more, you know? Of course, I also have to keep my dots up, but that's not like, yeah, I only have 2 dots, so it's not a big deal. So the filler rotation of a Moonkin is this, yeah? Okay, so I'm gonna enter my eclipse now with 2 Starfires, and then I cast Wrath. I'm only doing filler rotation now, yeah? Okay, this is it, yeah? This is my filler rotation. Okay, oh, my dot's running out, so I'm gonna press my dots. Oh no. Then I just keep casting filler. Like, oh, I enter the Lunar Eclipse. Now I cast the other spell for an eternity. You know, like, this is it. This is the whole filler rotation. And that is obviously boring. And I think a lot of people can agree with this, right? That it's boring. So how do you fix this? In my opinion, there's 2 ways on how you can fix this. And I talked about this earlier already. Number 1, you make the Astra power, like, you make us generate more Astra power, so we are able to use more spenders, right? Because spenders will make it more interesting because you have to think about when to use them and stuff, right? So by giving us more Astra power generation, we have to think about our spenders more, automatically making fillers less casted and therefore less important. The less often you have to cast fillers, the less important it is for the fillers to actually be interesting, right? And I think that's how melee classes work generally in WoW. The way melee classes work is that usually you use spenders a lot more. Almost every single melee class uses spenders more. And therefore the filler spells are not that important. Right? So that's how you could fix it one way. Give us more Astra power so we can spend more use more spenders. Or you keep the Astra power generation the way it is, but you make our filler cast more interesting in some way. Right? And I mean, there's obviously multiple ways on how you could make the filler spells more interesting. You could make it proc or something. So let's say, for example, my Starfire has a chance to make my Wrath something. Or you could say that when I'm in Solar Eclipse, then I have a chance to randomly go into Lunar Eclipse by doing something. You know what I mean? Just something to make it more interesting. So maybe I could, like, if I cast a combination of spells, then I'm gonna go from Lunar Eclipse to Solar or whatever. Or I can extend my something somehow. You know, like, I don't know what they could... Like, there's a bunch of things they could do, right? Your actions in any rotation should feel like the payoff is worth it. Nobody wants to have lots of actions and not feel like there's a reward at the end. I think if fillers are more mundane, it's okay if the payoff ability is worth it. Generally speaking, I think that is how MMO psychology works. Well, no, not necessarily. Like, I think it's actually the opposite. I think it's the complete opposite. If your fillers are mundane, boring, then I think you should be able to use your spenders more often, even if they do less damage, right? Because then you can forget about the fact that your fillers are boring, because you don't it's not the biggest part of your rotation. And the thing you're talking about with payoff, like, if my filler spells are like complex to use, but they don't do a lot of damage, I'm still gonna be happy because I get a big payoff at the end, right? Like, my filler spells do not need to do a lot of damage as long as I get a big payoff at the end. I don't think it needs to be directly correlated to the filler spells doing damage. Like, I don't need my Wrath to hit for like 1,000,000 damage just because it's a bit more complicated to like do my filler rotation. As long as I get a big payoff from the spender that I can use afterwards. Like, from the end of my rotation. Basically, if you turn off numbers, does the rotation still feel good? That's good to stun. Yeah, yes, exactly. Exactly. If you don't look at your numbers at all, do you still have fun pressing your rotation? That would be perfect, right?